Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 24th of October 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to be joined today by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives and Alex Thompson, who, of course, joins us from the Netherlands with Eastern Approaches. I'll just say, Mike, it's a pleasure to be back. I had a very busy time creating that storm. And now I've got the power to do that.
You're following up with 11 more, is that it?
I'm going to have a lot of fun in the future.
Excellent.
Yep. There we are.
Okay, well, we're going to start off with European Council because Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, was speaking this morning, and the mainstream media absolutely focusing on Brexit. Tusk suggested Brexit could be halted, apparently. This typical Guardian headline, missing the point completely. They're saying that Brexit can be stopped. Well, we're saying it never started. Apparently, Tusk said that negotiations could end in no Brexit if the British government wanted to. He said that ahead of us is still the toughest stress test. If we fail it, the negotiations will end in our defeat. We must keep our unity regardless of the direction of the talks. The EU will be able to rise to every scenario so long as we're not divided. And in fact, it is in fact up to London how this will end, with a good deal, no deal, or no Brexit. But in each of these scenarios, we will protect our common interest only by being together. So togetherness was absolutely the thrust of the speech. But the British mainstream media completely failed to miss the main point. And this is it. Tusk said that he would create an EU treasury by June, and woe betide anyone that gets in his way. That's my paraphrasing of what he said. So let's look and see what he actually said.
I will do everything in my power to take the first very concrete steps by June towards establishing the European Monetary Fund and strengthening the stability of the banking union. I still believe that it is possible. In June, it will become clear if I am an incurable optimist. But one thing I can promise you today. If we don't reach agreement by June, I will say precisely why it wasn't possible and who is responsible.
So, the European Monetary Fund, what is that? Well, this is a paper published by the European Union about the European Monetary Fund. To be honest, in typical European style, it's still to be decided exactly what form this is going to take. In the case of Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, actually no longer the German finance minister because he is moved to become a Speaker of the Bundestag. As far as he's concerned, the European Monetary Fund should be an Uber IMF, International Monetary Fund, combining financial firepower, as it's described in some places, with expertise in designing reform programmes, taking over budgetary oversight of all EU countries from the European Commission. And for others, for example, the Spanish finance minister, it's more akin to what he describes as a European treasury that would provide no-strings funding to member countries whose economic growth was found to be lagging behind the others. But the fact of the matter is that no matter which way you look at that, it's fundamentally a treasury-like institution which is being formed. In fact, this paper that's on screen at the moment argues against such a fund. The creation of a European Monetary Fund seems to be a natural next step, it says, to improve upon the European Stability Mechanism. This paper argues that such a step is neither necessary nor desirable for many reasons, but the fact is that Tusk is determined, and he's determined to carry it out by June next year. So, Brian, maybe now's the time to bring David Ellis in and ask for your thoughts on that. David?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, this is very, very straightforward. It's had to come out in the open. Now seems to be the time, and Mr. Tusk there is establishing the end game scenario to be out in June. So he's talking about unification, continued unification of everything. So this is unification of administration of money, budgets, and the key thing there that you've picked up on is obviously the thing that all the MPs and MEPs are not talking about and not going into, which is the the actual horizon analysis of and the strategic forecasting of what this thing will do. So yes, it is a treasury. That sort of framework. I mean, they might not want to call it that because obviously what that will instantly people will understand is that this thing is going to tax everyone. But he's actually said just how powerful this thing's going to be in terms of its boundaries, because it's budgetary oversight of all the nations means only one thing: single point absolute control of all of the money. So in terms of doing that, what it will be is absolute unification of everything. So this is where the military union comes in, the military unification. So obviously I've always said all along that will be the trigger for this. So we've just seen this happen at PESCO, where our ministers, I understand Alan Duncan and Boris Johnson have got something to do with this, but nonetheless, the buck stops with Mrs May, have agreed to all the requests at PESCO last week, and there's not a jot in the media about it, not a thing. So that's the key thing. So we've given the green light there with the military to continue the continuation of military unification process. Now Tusk has immediately gone straight onto his lectern, and he's now talking about an EU treasury. So there's the sequence. It's exactly as I forecast, and I know you guys have sort of been backing us, but we've been backing each other up with this mantra. But this is exactly as we forecast. So this is it. This is now. This is guns to bear now. This is the time when every shot is going to count. So this unification isn't going to stop. Brexit has just been the umbrella and the accelerant almost. It's almost been like putting ethyl methyl ketone peroxide on the democracy for them to accelerate into this, because this thing would be absolute. It's complete and total control. It'd be a tyranny like we've never seen in the continent.
I'll just add in there, David, you have been 100% correct saying what was going to happen. The military unification, harmonisation of the military to get Britain's forces cut back to a level which was on parity with the French in particular, to allow that European integration. So here we have it, the EU Treasury. You were talking about it for, well over a year, 2 years probably. UK column talking about it, nothing in the so-called mainstream media at all. So we have all been 100% accurate. We can now say we're also 100% accurate with everything that follows, which is massive and total European Union control. And that includes the military, that includes the police forces, that includes the intelligence services. So all of this is now being brought into the so-called EU superstate. And we've predicted it. We can now see these steps unfolding.
Well, here's the next one. Now, we mentioned that the Permanent Structured Cooperation PESCO fact sheet was published as a result of the European Council, or for the European Council meeting last week. This was on the agenda. If you remember last week when we showed you the agenda for the European Council meeting, the line item for this just said PESCO, no description, no explanation. Well, perhaps this piece of news is related. Because Defence24.com here and a number of other outlets reporting that Poland is about to increase its defence expenditure up to a level of 2.5% of GDP. This is a new bill that's been introduced. It's going to go through. The Polish Ministry of Defence, they say, has announced a new bill assuming that Polish defence expenditure would reach the level of 2.2% of GDP as of 2020, with a subsequent increase up to 2.5% of GDP until 2030. And what this effectively means is, alongside this raise in the budget, they are also raising the top limit of the number of personnel enlisted within the army, which is currently 150,000. That is going to be raised to 200,000. David, the point about this, I think, is that while Poland is increasing its army personnel, Britain is decreasing its army personnel, other countries decreasing theirs. The combined capability of individual nations is being, well, at least the capability of individual nations is being designed around this unified structure. So Poland increasing its number of personnel, what are these going to be, cannon fodder for some future war with Russia?
Well, they're clearly. Well, let's be frank about this. They're clearly mustering a bigger army, and they are next door to Russia. So there's not it doesn't take a lot of guesswork to see what their intentions are. Where our part in this, of course, is the French military and the British military are almost sort of intertwined, not just from the Lancaster House arrangements, but in terms of what's happened to them. Both militaries have been cut and cut and cut and cut. There's been bilateral agreements. We've now got trilateral agreements. And now with PESCO, we've got military unification to military union. So we've gone through the same process as France. We've cut and now we're joining, which is what I said at Winchester. It's exactly what I forecast would happen. There's been nothing in any of the chatter coming from either Cameron or May currently within the government and the Conservative Party to suggest there is any change in the tactic or the direction. So the command chain here, what we've got to see here now is this is the Marshall Plan in absolute purity. Save that, of course, that the Marshall Plan was only the name given to it from its authors at the Bank of International Settlements. So that's Montague Norman, Thomas McKittrick, and so on. So they're top board. So the command chain here for this, with what's happening, is we've got a conglomerate of Bank of England, Bank of International Settlements, and then thereby the ECB, which has been born from the BIS. So the command chain into Tusk comes from ECB BIS. And he's told that way what to do to get the Marshall Plan, which is obviously unification of everything, currency and military, and political, end up with finally political union. And of course, the command chain to May and the government comes via the Bank of England to the Treasury. So you can see the two streams. And what they're going to do is they're going to join up very, very quickly between here and June. And we will see this absolute unification unless the MPs do their job, start talking about this and bring the portcullis down, because Brexit is nothing like what actually is going on in the real world and what's being agreed over there in Europe. Tusk's just told everybody what the game is. I mean, that's it. Gloves off, guys. Come on, wakey wakey.
I'll just add one tiny bit in there, David. 200,000 troops for the Poles. I believe that we will see the creation of these Eastern European armies, because at the end of the day, it's my opinion, but I don't think that the American public will take the body count of another war in Europe. America will always go for the high-tech option. It will be using its super accurate weapons. But the fighting on the ground, the cannon fodder, is going to come out of these newly created EU Eastern forces. So Poland's there leading the charge, but ultimately they are there for the body count, because the Americans are not going to take it. The British can't, because we don't have any armed forces anymore to fight a war in Europe. So these people are just being used as cannon fodder.
David.
Yeah, really quickly. Yeah, I mean, Brian, that's great analysis. That's exactly the case. So, I mean, I've been putting it out there recently that, is this unification, could it be argued that it equates to German rearmament? Well, of course, they don't want to do that. They're going to get the Poles to do it. So there'll probably be some other nations chip in with that. But crucially with this, because hand in glove with escalation in mustering these troops and increasing the budgets, on the one hand, they're increasing the budgets, and two, look at the way it's going to be administered. It's going to be administered from Brussels under the EU Treasury. And what's going to happen is they're going to tax, and the tax bills are going to go up. So there's going to be compound tax in the EU Schengen zone. There will be national taxes. There will also be EU taxes. This is what's going to happen, because this Treasury that's all it's going to do. It's going to administer and it's going to raise taxes. And then it will be a state. And then it will have its final objective attained, which is full political union once it gets to that stage. So why on earth people are not waking up to this reality it's beyond belief. But just look at the mindset. I was told from now a very senior UKIP MEP, there are no votes in defence. Told me that without any reservation or equivocation. I said, crikey, it's like talking to a Conservative. That's the sort of things they've been telling me for years. There's no votes in defence. What a load of nonsense. British people love their military and they love the Queen, on the whole, as a majority. So this is the kind of nonsense that we're getting. It's like some kind of cognitive dissonance from these people. They can't see what's coming. They are just beggars belief.
Okay, well, sticking with Poland then, we've got this because NATO has now signed with Poland a new memorandum of understanding. This is a picture of the signing ceremony on screen at the moment, to set up a centre of expertise on military counterintelligence. The Centre of Expertise aims to expand the capabilities of the alliance, that's NATO, and its member nations to enhance NATO's counterintelligence and improve interoperability. It acts as a catalyst for NATO adaptation and operations by supporting the development, promotion and implementation of new policies, concepts, strategies and doctrine. This is according to NATO, of course. Now, speaking at this event, the Polish Defence Minister said that this new centre was fundamentally important, especially in face of threats from Russia. So let's bring Alex Thompson in at this point, and just ask, what are your thoughts on this? Is this what they're doing? I've captioned this Poland spying on Russia. It is a counterintelligence centre of excellence, but to put this in Poland is quite an interesting development.
It's a very interesting development, Mike, and one that makes perfect sense if you know your 20th century history. Now, something not known to those who haven't worked in intelligence, and particularly signals intelligence, as I did, is that it was the Poles who gave us the kickstart against the Nazi Enigma machine, and then after that to all the other elements of cryptography, breaking Nazi codes which were thought to be unbreakable, particularly the U-boat codes in the Kriegsmarine. Now, it was the Poles who gave us the head start circa 1935, and it was particularly to the French that they gave this information, although the British took over the Polish geniuses in the end. What this amounts to is if you look at the interwar era when Poland bullied Germany and other national minorities, it was acting as the long arm of France geopolitically. We've done a Balkans special recently, still behind our members' paywall. And you'll find out more about it there. But you need to look at the character of Edmund Hrashkiewicz, that's spelt with a CH at the beginning, one of these unspellable Polish names. Hrashkiewicz was the deep state man between the wars for the military regime, then increasingly unpleasant one, as all the countries in that part of Europe had between the wars. And his idea was that basically acting as the sharp end of French intrigue, Poland and its particular skill in devious counterintelligence could break up the Soviet Union and even Russia itself using its constituent nationalities. There were several elements to this plan, the best known of which is called his theory of Prometheanism, but it was the big vector that was carrying Poland through between the wars, being particularly an Anglo-French and especially French asset. And we now have this coming back into the frame. And meanwhile, if we go further south to Romania, where they speak a language very closely related to French and study French very carefully. There is still this adulation in Romania for the French military, which, don't forget, was through the 20th century was the big thing in Europe. It wasn't admiring German military prowess. It was the Eastern European countries admired French staff college techniques and French combined arms. So France is basically, with Macron having come to the fore, suddenly going to have these two, the northern and the southern tools, Poland and Romania, big bullying confidence nations in Eastern European terms, to keep pushing the Russian frontier and keeping the peoples of that zone of Europe subjugated. And a term that both Germany and Russia have used for this over the decades has been limited sovereignty. The peoples of Eastern Europe are going to be forced to give up their sovereignty and be suzerains to, as it now turns out, a global new world order. I'm increasingly certain is going to be headquartered in Europe using French military genius.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's bring in some of the latest headlines because they tell the story, don't they? Here we've got it, those nasty Russians at it again. So we've got the Daily Mail, Russia to test its Satan II ballistic missile this year, Russia to test new missile that can beat any defences. The Times, and Russia to test new missile that can beat any defence system in existence, The Independent 1 hour ago. So this is all very nasty and particularly unpleasant of those Russians to come up with a Satan missile. Well, it's interesting to look at the reports. The Telegraph here tries to get an extra bit of mystique in because they show some Cyrillic text. They've got a document here. This is due to the Russian government leaking some details on this missile. Russia unveils Satan II missile powerful enough to wipe out UK, France or Texas. I don't know why they've chosen Texas, whether that's InfoWars possibly, but they've got a reason for that. And what is this? This is fear factor. And the Telegraph pushes home on that because they've even got a little video where you can learn all about Russia's military arsenal in 90 seconds. So a lot of fear. Satan missile. This is all fear. The Russians are threatening to wipe out UK, France and Texas. Some puzzling reports on it. I just happened to find this one from the National Interest. Russia's new RS-28 Sarmat ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, a US missile defense killer. The analysis in this was pretty remarkable because the key thing about this missile is it can travel immensely quickly with 10 different warheads. I think it's about Mach 21 or close to it, which is about 4.5 miles a second. Sure, somebody will correct me on that. But according to this report, it says they may be referring to the missile being able to deliver nuclear weapons via the South Pole rather than the traditional over the North Pole route. So they completely ignore some of the major characteristics of this missile. But this is all those nasty, dangerous Russians. I'll bring our guests in just a second. Let's follow this through. Here's the Mail. Russia to test its Satan II ballistic missile that could beat any defences and obliterate an area the size of France. So we have to have a nice graphic showing the result of a 2,000 kiloton, I think it is, explosion. Kiloton, megaton. I beg your pardon, megaton, that's right. So there's the fear factor diagram. And of course, this is the Satan missile. So I thought I would just get people thinking by saying, well, let's remember, of course, that the British Ministry of Defence approved Satanism as being suitable in the British military. So that just gives us an interesting little spin on the Satan term. But of course, the missile is only Satan in NATO naming. It's actually the Sarmat missile as far as the Russians are concerned. So I think what's going on here is that we're ramping up the fear factor. But we've already got Satan as an equal opportunities employer in the Royal Navy. That's what the Ministry of Defence said. We're happy to have Satan in the Royal Navy. But as far as Russia's concerned, it's a bad thing, and they've not called their missile that. I hope people are following through where I'm coming from on this. I'm going to say this. How many Satanists then have we got employed in Britain's armed forces? Is the First Sea Lord a Satanist? Well, we don't know. Is the Secretary of State for Defence a Satanist? We're not sure. How do we know if none of this is declared? So, Alex, I'm going to bring you in here. I'm being very serious in what I say, but I'm trying to encourage people to think what's really going on. It's the Satan missile for Russia, but we're employing Satanists in the British Armed Forces. Who should we be frightened of?
We should be frightened of those in any nation whom we can't trust, Brian. It's not just a neutral thing to attain high office, whether in politics or the civil service or the military. It's a position of trust. When you got your officer's commission, it was a letter written in the name of the Queen saying, we trust you and we know your character to be good. The same is true of appointments to the Privy Council, to ministers of the Crown, etc., senior civil service posts. If we can't trust people at a gut level, and if there's prima facie evidence, for example, appearing on the RAINS list, which has never been sued or challenged, evidence that they may be Satanists and abusers, then be very afraid and ask the right questions. You're quite right, by the way, regarding the ballistic missiles, to point out that the Russian name is Sarmat, which means the Sarmatian, which is the name of the North Caucasus steppes tribesmen, basically the early Indo-Europeans who developed the culture that we all have now in Europe. It's exactly the same as the United States calling one of its ICBMs the Minuteman. It's paying a tribute to one of the heroic eras of warrior cast in their history, which brought about the situation they have now. So the naming of it as Satan, all the nomenclature is done by a cabal within NATO. It doesn't reflect Russia's intentions at all. For more detail on this, people should look at the interview with Joel Skousen, which is still on the front page of UK Column's website, in which he points out that the Russians, even at their most devious, are not interested in knocking out Western civilization. At their most devious, they would join with the Chinese and Israelis to take it over. So they would knock out our military forces, but they would leave our economy and population intact in order to rule over it.
Alex, as always, thank you for that. Well, against the background of those nasty Russians, I just want to remind people this is information that came in to UK column last week. I'm going to say I personally believe this report. I think it is a credible report from all of the detail that we've heard about problems with the manning of ships, the lack of specialists, spares problems, equipment that doesn't work. But this was the statement from a very well-informed source. Not one Royal Navy ship is 100% operational. There's about a 20% shortfall in Royal Navy warfare specialists. So that's one area where there's a problem. That's not the area. And the other piece of information we had is that the Royal Marines are effectively to be cut again, but also there's something very strange going on inside the Royal Marines. There's some very unpleasant bullying going on. And my take on this is that the Royal Marines are going to be subverted. They're going to be taken apart from the inside. Remember, of course, how the British government was quick to cut the regiment system because the regiments of localised troops were very, very good units. And this is the reality, a silence by the Ministry of Defence and silence from members of Parliament, including, of course, our very own local Conservative MPs, Gary Streeter and Johnny Mercer. But we're to be fearful of the Russians. Meanwhile, our own military is taken apart.
Well, we've also got to keep the diplomatic pressure on the Russians, or the pressure on the Russians in general, because today is the latest in the wardrobe dialogues. This is the dialogue between the UK and Georgia, which is been happening annually since 2014. So Sir Alan Duncan here has welcomed Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Georgia to speak to him. And of course they're dealing with, well, let's just look at what Mr Duncan had to say. The UK stands by Georgia in support of its territorial integrity, security and ambitious reform agenda. Alex, this meeting has been taking place since 2014. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the significance of it with regard to pressure on the southern borders of Russia.
Well, I would say, Mike, that we've seen since I left GCHQ and particularly since about 2012, we've seen the FCO and more particularly the MOD getting very interested in controlling Georgia directly, which is something that in my time in the previous decade we left to the Americans and played second fiddle. And it's one yet more pointers, just like we had at the beginning of this broadcast with David Ellis talking about the EU taking over monetarism for the world and basically repatriating it from America, where we had the IMF. It's another indication that the brains in the city have decided to bring all the muscle and expertise home from using America in the past and other client states. And now we're going to do it directly. So we're going to apparently impress these Georgians that we have the best political culture and so on. Using the name of Marjorie Wardrop is quite sacrilegious because I happen to have here the National Georgian Epic Vepri Strausani, which Marjorie Wardrop translated, which was a major cultural achievement, proving to the British and the West that the Georgians were our cultural equals. And now this dialogue seems to be all about wrecking Russia. So it's not at all something that the poet who wrote Vepri Strausani would want to see, or Marjorie Wardrop herself, because she invested her life in peaceful understanding between Britain and Georgia with no anti-Russian angle at all.
Well, look, I'm glad you told me about her, but I just want to give a quick correction there, because it's not her that is caused the name. It's actually the first UK's Chief Commissioner to Georgia, Oliver Wardrop, that gave the name.
Ah, yes, that's her husband, right. Yes. But even he was involved in quite peaceful dialogue at the time.
Okay. Well, what are the four freedoms for the EU?
Well, David Scott has pointed out in the past that there's a fundamental flaw in the European single market, again, pushed by the city through Mrs. Thatcher, not a native continental idea for the EEC or the EU, as it later became. The Brits pushed the single market on Europe, and David Scott has pointed out the fundamental flaw in it, which is that three of the items mentioned as free for movement don't have brains, which is goods, services and capital. Labour, that's people. they do have brains. And here we have some Romanian bad boys this is from a previous incident, just for illustrative purposes in the Algemeen Dagblad article, but the article itself is about a more recent case of it. But here's a good screen cap of what happens. These Romanian ne'er-do-wells make use of the three other freedoms in Europe to drive down motorways, that's the services, in their cars, that's the capital, and they plunder goods in transit in Western European highways. So there you see the Labour as the chaps in the black suits at the top pulling the stuff out. So it's just a compact way of illustrating the flaw and the evil in this, in being told that if we want access to Europe, we must have the indivisible four freedoms, because three of those items are controlled by people and have no morals or brains of their own, and the fourth very much can choose what to do. So we have the human condition and the matter of having to contain sin and evil, as Brian was just mentioning. So when you hear four freedoms, bear in mind that it's a sleight of hand for introducing or slipping under the radar that evil human intent, and even worse than human, can be slipped into an otherwise economic arrangement.
Okay, well, let's move on to expenses, scandals. And here's an article from Politico that you wanted to cover. MEP expenses. This is a member of the European Parliament. Expenses should be kept secret to avoid pressure from the media. I hadn't noticed that the media was applying any pressure, except when it suits them to. For example, the Mirror here saying that there's a new House of Lords expenses scandal. Apparently, several peers who have not taken part in any debates or taken part in any votes have claimed £400,000 of taxpayer cash. And so this is now causing new calls for an end to the House of Lords, Alex. But it seems that, there's only pressure from the media on expenses scandals when there's some political agenda at work.
Oh, it's hugely political here, Mike, because if people track down that Politico article or any other reporting on it, they will see that the case has been brought by journalists, and it's all very incestuous intra-EU affair, because it relates to MEPs who sit in Brussels and then Strasbourg once a month, but it's being held in Luxembourg, where the Court of Justice of the EU is. And more than that, the respondent side in this case, the MEPs themselves who want to keep their expenses out of the territory of freedom of information requests, they have an EU lawyer to argue for them before the EU judges. And what she says, using some pretty sloppy Americanized idioms so that the standards of law are slipping, or lawyers particularly, she says that this would it would forbid them, if they knew their expenses were being tracked, it would forbid them from carrying out their mandate on behalf of the people, and other such nonsense. And incredibly, even the judge raised an eyebrow about this. She said that if it would be impossible to release all these data because it's millions of pages of expenses claimed in filing cabinets, and there's no electronic version of it. Yeah. Now, how's that for credibility?
Absolutely. Well, sorry, did you want to comment?
I only wanted to say that wouldn't have been a Scottish judge, of course, because north of the border, the Scottish judges don't release any details about their private expenses.
Absolutely. Well, just lastly on the EU, on EU issues, this is, you've highlighted this or headlined this as lid coming off the original Gladio network, Alex.
If people watch our long special on Eurasia, which is available on our YouTube channel and elsewhere for the general public now, we talk about Gladio, Eric Zeus in particular does, and we make reference to a 1992 BBC Two Time Watch documentary. A simple search on a video network for Time Watch Gladio will bring it up, particularly YouTube, although I don't want to plug them particularly, but that's the easiest way to find it. Between 82 and 85, in Belgium and Italy in particular, there were these awful random attacks. In Italy, it was train station bombings. Bologna was the most heinous of them. And in Belgium, it was supermarket shoot-ups by these tueurs fous de Brabant, the crazy Brabant killers, as The Guardian calls them. But the Dutch version of the name is the Bender van Nijvel, the Nivelle gang. Well, it was always suspected that, as with the whole Gladio picture, this was NATO using fake communists and fake fascist groups to cause panic, the so-called strategy of tension. And now we've had a deathbed confession by a former elite policeman of the Diana network in Belgium, confess on his deathbed to a relative that he was it, and the relative has now told the police, and that's come out a year after being told. So we have, I think, all the pieces are falling into place now that Gladio, which is, of course, as Sibel Edmonds says, has migrated into the use of the Turks now for geostrategy. That really was something planted by the city and Wall Street through MI6 in the 1970s and 80s, and any idea that it was real communist or nationalist violence is falling apart.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on to law and the Commonwealth. The question is, what is the role of the Commonwealth in the future? Well, we get a clue here because this is the Law Ministers' meeting, which has just taken place, and it has ended with a pledge to reform key legislation regarding the law. So apparently they say Commonwealth citizens are set to benefit from improved legal services in a range of areas as law ministers ended their meeting in the Bahamas, of course, where else would you have it, Brian, with a package of agreements and pledges. Baroness Scotland said the theme of the meeting was strengthening the rule of law through technology. So we offered all ministers access to our Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform, which provides technical assistance and an online platform with best practice guides, model laws, standards, templates, and legal insight on a range of issues. Well, look, who's driving this? It's being driven through the Commonwealth now, but actually this is directly coming from the Ministry of Justice. We've been talking about this, I think it was 2015, that Lord Leveson published his report on the future of the justice system in the UK. This was the digital director for HM Courts and Tribunals Service, Kevin Gallagher. He was speaking I think the middle of last year on this issue. Now, just to give an impression of who he is, he was previously Chief Information Officer at Channel 4, where he brought digital to the forefront, apparently, of the organisation's business model. He also worked in the private and public sector organisations, including the Legal Aid Board. But anyway, he was giving this speech where he was talking about modernisation of justice through technology and innovation, which is at the heart of the plans of the Ministry of Justice. And as I say, he cited Brian Leveson when he spoke to this event the previous year, and Brian Leveson had highlighted the needs for change and gave his support to the plans of the Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service, which of course involves electronic justice, however you want to define that. Anything from giving evidence via Skype to being able to plead guilty without actually having to attend court at all. You can just do it by clicking a button online. How far does this go, Brian? It starts to get a bit dodgy, but don't worry about it. We're rolling it out to every Commonwealth country on the planet.
Immensely dangerous, Mike, and I think many people in this country still don't understand how far the change agenda in the court system has gone, because many places it's difficult to get into the court buildings themselves as a member of the public. So the public coming in to see and hear justice being done, that's out the window. And also, as you're quite rightly saying, the push is to get people using an electronic system. Don't worry, you can come into court on Skype and you can plead guilty electronically. Well, as the Melanie Shaw case has shown, that many times she is supposed to have appeared in court. She's been given a Skype link from prison, and then at a critical part of the trial, the Skype connection mysteriously breaks. So this is very, very dangerous stuff. Courts coming under control, justice coming under control. Next section is really on media. Just as a little lead-in from me, I picked this one up. I couldn't resist talking about it. BBC News, the police let down modern slavery victims, says a report. So the BBC in as an attack on the police. They're not doing their job over modern slavery victims, but of course the BBC was in attacking the police when it was investigating child abuse around Ted Heath. And we've only got to have a look at some of the articles that come up. There's lots of them where the BBC certainly didn't want the police investigating the abuse of children when Ted Heath is concerned. So utter hypocrisy. But what a dangerous situation we have in the UK with the BBC, simply the state broadcaster. Makes Pravda look completely amateur.
Absolutely. And Alex, you wanted to highlight the strange priorities of The Guardian.
Yes, Mike, we won't have time to go through them, but people can freeze the screen or look up the article on Medium, which is 13 Things I Learned from 6 Years at The Guardian. The lady who wrote this has been the SEO expert. That's how she started off, the search engine optimization, which is how to be noticed in Google searches, and basically went on to a position at The Guardian, which was to get people to read it more. particularly The Guardian Australia was where she spent most of that part of her career. But the 13 things she's given us to cogitate upon are not for us, not even for journalists. They're for the technocratic managers who manage the journalists now. And if people read through them in slower time, even just the titles themselves are pretty chilling. And they're not about writing truth, investigating truth. And in many cases, she's advising that people almost pay less attention to that and pay more attention to how to get eyeball and how to get impressions. You know, the number of times people hear a certain truth or falsehood repeated and stamped onto their consciousness shows us a lot about what the mainstream media is, and slots in well with the Media on Trial event of last week.
The slide you sent me through on this one, I've changed the graphic for it because I wanted to go back to the original report. This is the Gatestone Institute on the issue of censorship in Germany. We've obviously been talking about the issue of censorship in the UK over the last number of weeks, and how the British government is driving this and seems to be driving the social media companies on this issue. But this suggests that the situation in Germany is just as bad, if not worse.
Yes, it's particularly because the Federal Justice Minister in Germany, Heiko Maas, has been pushing this for a long time. And in fact, a man who was in Merkel's governing Christian Democrat Party, who calls himself der Silberjunge, the silver lad, because he advises on precious metals now, he has said that Heiko Maas is the rapist of free speech in Germany. Maas has basically been doing some shadow trials for a while, using the infamous Bertelsmann Media Corporation, or overseeing the way in which they have basically done this on an outsourced basis for Facebook in Germany, sifting through all the comments for anything politically incorrect or unsayable. And now this is being put on a statutory basis with massive fines for those who don't make people unsay things within 24 hours on social media. So this node of the experiment of thought control is being rolled out from Germany outwards. Others are being pioneered in other jurisdictions like Scotland or Wales. It's a very worrying one indeed, and the Gatestone Institute is quite right to pick up on it. But there is hope, because Mr. Maas appeared last year for his Labour Day speech in the eastern state of Saxony, and was whistled and chased back to his car by a bunch of local men shouting, "Get out of here, traitor."
Okay.
Serious stuff. My mind just comes back to the Media on Trial event, and how many people, over 500 people in that room, people interested that we've now got facts and figures coming out from organisations other than the so-called mainstream media. And it's very clear that journalists working for the larger newspapers and the BBC and other TV stations now realise that the public are looking at them. So I think there's some very encouraging things starting to happen. But the main thing is that we get people taking action. It's no good taking the information in. You've got to get on the phone to MPs, even onto the newspapers and the editorial teams themselves, pushing, asking questions, demanding that they correct stories that are clearly fake news. It's up to each and every one of us to do something. It's not enough to sit and just watch this thing unfolding. So I see that as a positive position. We can do something.
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight Robert Stewart again, because he's been single-mindedly going after the BBC over their Saving Syria's Children report and documentary. He's now got MPs interested in the thing, asking questions about it, much to the chagrin of the mainstream media, and one particular Guardian journalist who's asking questions about why a so-called conspiracy theorist is being taken seriously. He's being taken seriously because he has done some extremely deep research into what they did over that report, and he has raised some very valid questions. But that's what one individual has done. Imagine what would happen if 1,000 individuals were taking similar, other reports from mainstream media and offering the same level of scrutiny.
We would be making much faster progress. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to end there on the quarter of an hour, or just about 3/4 of an hour, or just about. And we'll say, get out there, start to take some action, talk to other people. We know what's happening. Britain is under attack at the moment from within, and it's up to us to expose it and stop it. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.